Well, I'm most thankful for this invitation, when it's a great honor. And when I was invited to speak on academic scientific prospects of Göbeklitepe culture, I was a little bit startled because it said science faculty, not archaeologist. So just speaking about Göbeklitepe would be something different. And then speaking about scientific prospects will be another lecture. So I try to combine two lectures into one lecture, so it's a kind of a mishmash, and I hope it will not be too boring. In the beginning part of my lecture, I will be mainly speaking about what we understand what is present-day archaeology is, because I think there are some kind of misunderstandings. What we archaeologists do and how we do it. So there's a kind of an introduction to it. I must apologize for my colleagues in the archaeology department because it was very repetitive for them. I think it's just what they know, but I think it's too late to change it. And in the second part of my talk, I will be mainly presenting the Göbeklitepe culture because I think that's one of the trends everybody seems to be interested with the Göbeklitepe. Well, before coming here, just when we were having a lunch, one of my old colleagues asked me, why is everybody interested in archaeology? Because I think there's something wrong with the definition of archaeology, what archaeology is. So before starting anything, I think we should try to understand what archaeology is. It's a science. For us, it's a science. But for others, it's a kind of a political tool to politicize the past. You can put anything into it. It's a touristic asset. It's a kind of a check in the checklist. You go to touristic places. So it's a hobby. It's a kind of investment. It's antiquarianism. So it can be. So you can have different type of archaeologists depending on what you want to understand. Actually, the general understanding of archaeology in the general public is also something not very correct. Everybody thinks that we are looking for something very interesting or we are trying to find something. Every time we go to the field, every time I come back from the field at the end of the summer, my friends will ask, oh, did you find it? No, I said, no, I didn't find it. We were not looking for anything. We are looking for knowledge. That is difficult for general public. It's difficult to make them believe that we are doing science. We are trying to understand. We are a kind of a lab, and we are not looking after sensations. We are not trying to find goodies. We are not trying to fill the museums. Okay, something we find, they go to the museums. They are of touristic value, but we are trying to understand the past. And people, when you popularize archaeology, people think that we are eccentric people. We are trying to kind of a masochism. We are trying to work in dust, work under difficult conditions. We are trying to look for treasures. No, we are not. We are trying to do sciences. In this respect, when you come to the case of Göbeklitepe, I think it's an ideal site for speculations and to collate speculations with science, because as you can see from the picture on the lower right, where our late dear colleague Klaus Schmidt is, the scale of things which appeared at Göbeklitepe are monumental, are extraordinary, are really astonishingly huge. So to a normal public, it also went with lots of speculations. And regretfully, I would say, our colleagues in the excavation had also some biases, excavating more cult buildings, temples. So it turned out to some kind of it was publicized as the center of religion, beginning of religion. So there's even, it's called the Garden of Eden is there. So at the end it turned out something like a Mecca or Vatican, which is not. I will come back to it. Or others, other speculations about extraterrestrial alliance coming and working there. I can give many more samples. At least a month ago, there was another press. It said 12-ton gold statue of a bull had been recovered at Göbeklitepe. So there's no end to speculation. So we are not going into it. So it brings us back to how we define archaeology. Or actually, archaeology is one of the sciences. There are many sciences looking at the past, paleontology, history, paleolinguistics, and whatnot. We are archaeology is also dealing with the past and with the human past. So there are two basic ways of looking at the past. One of them is the traditional, conventional way. The past, you have to believe in the past. You don't question it. You don't look for evidences. And the past is flat. It has no time dimension. So you don't have to prove it. You believe in it. And that's the conventional way. And you are only interested in the group you identify yourself with. It can be ethnic, it can be religious, it can be regional, but you are not interested in the past of the other communities. So that's the conventional way of looking at the past. The scientific way of looking at the past, we have to ask questions. We don't believe in the past, but we question the past. Asking questions to the past, we want to learn, and then you need proofs. You need it's like in the sciences, you need a proof which can be asserted. And time has a time depth. It's a dynamic past. It's a changing, dynamic, changing past. So everything changes, everything evolves. Your environment, your physical body, your culture, natural environment, everything is changing. So it's a kind of a dynamic past which is constantly changing, and you have to understand it. And the other part of it is that you have to look at it in global perspective. Just looking at your own identity, when you go back, you don't know what your identity was, so you have to develop a global perspective. So that's what the new scientific archaeology is. Of course, how we define, how we understand them, or our answers to the questions depend on your methodology and the questions you are asking. The past is multifarious as present. There are different cultures. There's everything in the past. To the past cultures at any period is as colorful, as multidimensional, multifarious as present. So the picture of the past would depend on what you ask, which questions you are asking. You can ask about their subsystems, you can ask about the art, you can ask about their questions, but you have to, and your questions depend on, usually the questions we ask depend on the present fashions or traditions or conventional questions. When I was a student, one of the most interesting, most of the interest in the past was what they were eating, some subsistence patterns. Later, most of the interest shifted into environmental, how the cultures adapted to changing environment. Now the more social aspects are coming front. So you can have different questions and you can ask different questions. And the results and answer you will be getting also depends on the tools you are using. Happily, we are not measuring things like this now, so there's different modalities. So it's a kind of a past. And our lab is the archaeological deposits, whatever has remained from the past. It can be a mound, it can be a tumulus, it can be a flat site, it can be a workshop, it can be a field is used, it can be anything of the past remain which was connected to the human being, to the human culture. So these are what archaeological archives, but the difference between this is a kind of a library archive, but the pages have been torn and some have been disappeared. So we are, with archaeologists, we have to deal with the evidence, with an archive, which is not in a good state, so we have to get the most out of it. So the tools we are using depends on what methodologies we are using. And these silent archives became active, the knowledge becomes active when an archaeologist starts working at that site. It's like in a chemistry lab or a biology lab, the molecules are there, it's binocular, microscope is your tool. When you look with the microscope and you start producing knowledge, data, then it becomes active knowledge. Otherwise, everything is there. It's the same as archaeologists. The sites are there. The archaeological deposits are there. Only when we start working, they become active and usable knowledge. And when we start working, first thing we give is we give them a time depth. So we have to understand it with a time scala that it has a depth. So we are not speaking of a flat past, but we are speaking of a past with a depth. Don't worry, I will not go into details of this chart, but then we can see different pictures of, we can talk about the environment, we can talk about technology, we can talk about subsistence patterns or interactions or global migrations, movements, chemical changes, seam changes. So it's at multiple dimensions, so we have to look with multiple dimensions. And other things we have to come with is how to find to recover the sites. In the past, we were just trying to understand from archives, from purely archaeological methods, but now we have other tools like prospection methods. We can from geophysics and from other natural sciences, and now also aerial photography. So now we have a number of non-destructive methods to recover the sites and to try to understand where we have to look for the answers. So our tools are developing, each year new tools are developing, and also the problem is that how old is it? In the past we were dependent on our guesses or on calendar things, but now thanks to the development in the natural sciences, not only radiocarbon dating but with other isotopic methods, now we have other tools to date, so we are getting more and more precise dating, but these are all in collaboration with all other sciences. And we have to understand the changing environment. It's not only the macro changes, but like this ice age or sea level changes, but there are macro fluctuations. Climatical variations are changing, so we need the evidence, because in every region they have different impacts of the soil formations, lacustrine environments, and everything is changing, so we have to also look with the dimension of the time. And this bioenvironment is getting more and more important, significant, not only with pollens, with fauna, but with dendrochronology, but now there are multiple tools to read the soil and everything, and that's why it comes with the collaboration with the natural sciences. And one of the basic other questions is who were they? In the past, of course, physical age, gender, and the body build, but now there are other tools which we can use from isotopic methods or with geochemistry and biochemistry and everything. So we can now speak about fertile stress environments or their mobility. And even with the DNA, now we can learn much more data about the past and the human beings. These are rapidly developing fields. I'm not going to say all of them, but I think when we speak about the science and archaeology, any science, any field of research which is dealing with the earth and the human beings is a part of, we have to collaborate with archaeology. Because we are looking at the past. We are trying to understand the environment of human beings lived. For example, in the past when we were looking at pottery, we were just looking at stylistic or technology, how they were made and what were they made, their shape and their connections. But now we can do it with residue and what they are eating or with their fermenting and all kind of different modalities. Now there are different tools to understand how they were used and what they were doing with. And also with biosciences, as I mentioned before, especially with micromorphology, microsedimentology, and all kind of new modalities, is opening a completely different new picture of the past, so our understanding is changing. I could have given many more examples of interaction with science, but I think any field of research which is dealing with the Earth, or even with the space, we can use it. Can be correlated with archaeology, because we live in an environment, we live in this world. So to understand culture, you have to understand it with this environment, with all its modalities. So the basic question when I was asked the prospects of scientific research in understanding the past, I think we can use everything. I have been just visiting one of this beautiful functional labs here, but I think there's no end to it. So anything, any kind of research, any kind of natural scientific research or either on earth, soil, water, or atmosphere, the knowledge is most welcome to collaborate with archaeology. We are producing material for these labs, and I think we are also, collaboration with archaeology helps to develop the perspectives. For example, the best example is how radioactive carbon dating developed. Libby, when he was developing, he understood that radioactive carbon had a half age. He needed a dated sample from archaeology so that he could calibrate the date of, calculate the date of radioactive carbon. So it's not a one-way relation between natural sciences. It's a two-way. We are kind of a time lab for the other sciences. Okay, going back to Göbekli, when you look at this chart, so monumentality, monumental temples and other things, really, when you just look at this, Göbeklitepe looks like a striking thing. So I think that when you just put it like this, it all looks very out of order. But we know that when you look at the general terms, the cultural history, there's no miracles. Things develop gradually. There's always a cause and effect factor, is at least in the great big picture, is almost effective. So we have to look with how things develop, but when you just get the end picture of it, it looks very strange, and that's what I will be saying with Göbeklitepe also. Göbeklitepe came out with monumentality, with belief system, with symbolism. However, we know from since last 200 years that even in the Upper Paleolithic, even now earlier than that, at least in mind you come to 36,000 years ago, there was a high level of abstraction, selection of talented artists, symbolism, and there were statues, also the Upper Paleolithic. There were even cult buildings, like this constructed out of mammoth teeth. So belief systems, the cultic practices started much earlier, about 40,000 years earlier than Göbeklitepe. So it does not mean that Göbeklitepe is not important, but it does not just happen as a snapshot by itself. So it has a past. Then, from another point of view, when Göbeklitepe, what does it stand for? It stands for the time when sedentary farming way of living appeared first time appeared in the world. Since the beginning of when we started the first human beings, they were hunters, gatherers, food collectors. Part of them were partially sedentary, but they were not producing food. There were some cases where, even in the earlier times, there was food collecting, but none of them developed into a kind of a way of living. And what happened in what we call the Neolithic period really triggered the later developments and became a global system, which later led to urbanization, formation of cities, empires, and all the developments all the way up to the Industrial Revolution. So I will be basically going into it. The term Neolithic has an old history. I will not go into details of this list, but it began as a technological term to differentiate a certain way of shaping tools out of stone, not by flaking, but by grinding. So early in the 19th century, it was understood that there is a time period when people started shaping their tools in a different way. Then gradually it became clear that when this technological change took place, also these people started farming, so they were a completely different way of living. And gradually, the technological term of Neolithic, new stone, was transferred into a subsistence pattern. And then it was with the Golden Child, he put it into an economical dimension into it, saying that the economy and social culture is changing with it. But now we see it Neolithic as a completely different way, which I will be going on with this lecture. That is a kind of cultural phenomenon and not only subsistence or environmental considerations. So the interest on Neolithic period is not just for archaeology, because it is the beginning of many things. And there had been, especially during all through the 20th century, there had been great interest in how to define Neolithic. When I was a student in 1960s, Neolithic, we considered Neolithic period, beginning of Neolithic, as a very, very simple period. There was a mother goddess representing fertility because they were farming. There were first architecture, sedentarism, simple buildings. They had pottery because of cooking, so they had to made a cooked meal. Grinding, so they could process cereals, and the stone industry. However, later, to make this long story short, we now know that Neolithic period had quite a long history. It started in what we call the pre-pottery stage around somewhere in the 11th millennium BC. And in the beginning, they were not really farming, but they became gradually sedentary. They became gradually farmers, and they become really, truly farmers only by 7000s. So it's a long history, and it did take place only in a very small geography, which I will be defining. So, but here, the later part of my talk, I will just speaking about this area, which is in this green area, green part of this chart, from the pre-pottery to the beginning of the pottery Neolithic, which represents the Göbeklitepe culture. Actually, the history of Neolithic in Anatolia became rather late because Anatolia was considered as an area of secondary Neolithization until recent, because of its climatical conditions. But and due to that reason, most of the Neolithic research has been taking place in the other parts of the Near East, in the area south of Turkey, in the Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and other parts. There are more than 350 excavated Neolithic sites. In the Balkans, there are more than 400, and all over Turkey, we can define Neolithic period only with 56 excavated sites, but they are exciting. So, there was always a question, why and where and when did this sedentary farming communities began? We now can more or less define an area, and at least three different core areas, knowing each other, interacting, but having different type of cultural modalities. I will be speaking only on the one in the middle, secondary region, which is southeastern Turkey, where Göbekli is. So that is a completely different type of Neolithization. And this area, the first excavation in the southeastern Turkey and northern Syria and northern Iraq is also in it, and possibly western Iran also. The first excavation by Çambeli and Breydut, it was a Çayönü, and then there was, and the other excavations were mainly triggered by the salvage operations along the Euphrates dam projects, like Nevalachori and Caferhöyük, and now later with the Ilısu dam projects. And so this opened up a completely new picture of a Neolithic. So Göbeklitepe is one of these sites. When we look in this, and now we know more than this area with more than 14 excavated Neolithic sites. When we look at this general picture, we can now see that it is not bound with environmental conditions. We see these earliest Neolithic sites in any kind of region, in any kind of environmental area, in the riverine valleys, in hilltops, in semi-arid regions, in inter-mountain plains. So in the earlier years, we were thinking beginning of Neolithization with a certain, with one type of environmental conditions, but we now know there's a diversity. So Neolithic is a more or less a cultural phenomenon. How we look at the, as I mentioned before, well, how we look at how we picture the past depends on our data. When we were asking in the beginning, earlier years, that Neolithic is basically it's beginning of cultivation, that is domestication or cultivation of wild cereals, lentils and legumes, then a small sounding was sufficient. Because from the small sounding you could get a sample of wheat or barley or a bone of a sheep, and you could test whether it was domesticated or in the process of domestication. But this gave nothing about social complexity. That's why for many years we thought, our picture of the Neolithic period was a very simple society, trying to strive by using cereals, which is quite difficult. However, in the salvage operations in Turkey especially, had larger exposures. The first largest exposure was Çayönü. We excavated more than 6,000 square meters. And then other Neolithic sites had also larger exposures because of salvage and because of Turkish bureaucratic regulations. Once you start excavating, you cannot change it. You have to continue, which is somewhat good. So it produced a very different picture of looking at the social structuring of the region, of the period, which we didn't know before. And this is, for example, a little bit out of big date, a picture of Göbeklitepe, which is now the excavated area, much larger than that. What we began seeing is a very dynamic period. It's a kind of in the beginning, in the earliest stages. They start very simple, but but in most of the conventional, traditional societies don't have a changing momentum. The Neolithic of the Southeast Anatolia, which, of course I mean also northern Syria, is a very dynamic society trying to change, and it's in look for new novelities, which is very strange. So especially you can trace it very clearly in architecture and settlement patterns. So they began in the beginning, in the pre-Pottery Neolithic A period, in around 10,000s, with round, simple huts with some sunken floors. And gradually, when you come to the end of the pre-Pottery Neolithic in 7,500s, now they have rectangular buildings, structural. They have solved all the structural problems. They have the corner bindings. They have the foundations, flat roof, multi-story buildings. So the modalities of present-day village architecture has already been developed during this pre-Pottery culture by trial and error. Why did it happen? Because once they became fully sedentary and getting culturally complex, they needed a larger space. They needed functionally differentiated spaces, which is difficult to make in a round architecture. So as you can see in this picture in the middle, the grills, they needed a larger space, which became rectangular by itself without corner bindings, with a kind of a roofing, simple roofing as in some simple hut. Then they tried to solve it, and they invented mud brick and foundations and other things, corner bindings, which was quite difficult, but they did it. So throughout the Neolithic period, from the pre-pottery Neolithic period, before the introduction of pottery, a dwelling became a house, and the house became a home. It added new concepts, new functions into it, new modalities. So it's not just a dwelling where you sleep and stay, but it had other functions. You had divided spaces. So it really became a completely different, and that's one of the most important developments that took place in the southeastern Anatolia. And as I mentioned before, that grew into villages and multi-story buildings and mud bricks and other things. Other thing which started developing during this time period is land ownership. Because these buildings are repeatedly renewed in the same place, they had to be renewed. So, as you can see in this picture, one of the grill buildings at China, as 5 rebuilding layers, they're on the same spot. It means that somebody was owning that spot, or it also means that there was a decision-making group who said, yes, this is your area, then you have to build your house here, it is yours. So it's a kind of a completely new concept of land ownership. And by excavating large areas, we were also very surprised to see that these are not ad hoc villages like present-day Near Eastern villages, but they had a pre-planned designing. It also implies that there is a strong decision-making group who says, now you have to build your house here in this orientation, living in open space, in this plan. You are not allowed to do your building anywhere. You do no more annexes. So it's a very strict society, well organized. And then it also, we can see that at certain periods, built areas and open spaces change, then there's a big town plaza is formed, and around the plaza, there are still domestic buildings, but much bigger than the other ones. So it gives, there's elite groups, there's a kind of a stratified society, even as early as the pre-pottery Neolithic, which we were not expecting before. We can multiply these surprising things, but one of the things is becoming what we call the cult buildings, or what we can now possibly say the temples. Again, when I was studying archaeoprehistory with Braidwood and Chambers, to speak of a cult building or special building of the Neolithic period would be very embarrassing, where I would have been kicked out of the department. Braidwood, who was one of the theoretizations of Neolithic archaeology, strongly believed that it was an egalitarian society with nothing special. He tried to see it as a completely egalitarian society. When we first started finding the first non-domestic looking buildings at Chayone, he tried to see them as houses, and finally when we found what's the so-called skull building with 460 burials in it, he said, yes, there is something special. Then we started calling them special buildings. Then later we were dared to call them cult buildings. But now I think we can, after Göbeklitepe and Nevalachori, we can call them real temples. Why temples? A cult building is a building, a special building is a building, but any building can be a cult building. You can make a practice. But in a temple, it is built to be in a special plan and design. It's like a mosque or a church or a cathedral. You don't have to find anything in it to say that it's a mosque or a church. Even the plan type speaks that it's a mosque or a church. The cult buildings or temples of pre-pottery Neolithic in the southeastern Anatolia, from Tigris to Euphrates, they have a very standard plan type, designing, construction technique, which is completely different from the houses. They have revetment walls, their floors are sunken floors, they have buttresses on the walls, they have niches on the walls, there is always a kind of a bench along the walls, they have impermeable flooring, and from the earliest period on, they are built to be special and not for and there's nothing domestic in it. So it's even in the beginning of the pre-pottery Neolithic, you can see that this concept of special cult building was already there. Of course, it's, when the early settlements we know from 10,000 or 9,800, from a very large geographical area, that they're all similar, it means that it must have a developing stage somewhere else, which we still don't know. In any case, coming back to Göbeklitepe was this the Mecca or this Vatican. We now know that around Göbeklitepe, at least there are 12 sites which have the same kind of architecture, same kind of cult buildings. So it is one of the cult centers, big one, but it is not the only one. It's not the realist Vatican of the pre-pottery Neolithic. All of these cult buildings or temples or whatever we want to call them, they have monolithic slabs in it. Some of them are anthropomorphic, especially those along the Euphrates are anthropomorphic, huge. Those in the Tigris Basin are smaller, more flat. They don't have the reliefs on it, and some have trace of paint. So basically, the concept is the same, but stylistically they are different between the Euphrates and Tigris basins. And also in the Tigris basins, there are some sculptured ones, but not as clearly evident as the ones in the Euphrates basin. And when you get the earlier part of it, because I don't want to go into that detailed, boring chronological detail, but pre-pottery Neolithic period, we divided into two parts, A and B, for some strange reasons, which has a long history, which is not very interesting just by coincidence, but there is a change. So A means the earlier part of it, from somewhere from 10,000 to 8,500, and B is a little bit later part of it. In the Neolithic, pre-pottery Neolithic A, the buildings are much bigger, monumental. It's a much flourishing culture. Really, the flourishing part of Neolithic is A. So all these round dwellings also belong to Neolithic A. So like the domestic areas, cult buildings, the temples are also but bigger, as you can see in the book. When you come to pre-pottery B, the part of it, like the domestic buildings, the temples are also now become rectangular, but they carry on the same modalities of the previous thing. They have the buttresses, they have the niches, they have the banks around the walls, they have the standing stones and impermeable floorings. It's like the change from the mosque plan from early medieval to late medieval or to present. So the basic concept of mihrab is there, everything is still there. Of course, when Göbeklitepe, we knew Göbeklitepe since 1963, first time it was recovered. First excavation at Göbeklitepe had been in 1993 by Harold Hopman. And we already by that season, it was evident that there were monumental buildings, which we knew from other sites. But the site became socialized or propagated only when a picture of it appeared in the National Geographic. That had the impact. People were waiting for it. Of course, the National Geographic picture was a little bit biased as sensation. It made a building which is monumental high, monumental freestanding building. But then there are other questions that needed to be answered. Was it roofed or not? Or was it really freestanding? Oops, I was backwards, I think. Sorry. So when we look at the evidence now, from all, not only from Göbeklitepe, but with all the other sites, it's clear that these buildings had been roofed, with a very light roofing. Because all the sculpture pieces, all the plasters which were found in the buildings, had no trace of erosion, they were very fresh, and now that they had been excavated for 10 years, now they're eroding. The erosion has already started. Now, regretfully, the Göbeklitepe reliefs are completely disappeared now. So they must have been roofed in the original, and it must be a very light roofing. And the picture on the upper left is what Krupkat is the architect of the Göbeklitepe excavations. That is the restitution of the roofing system. The roof is supported by the standing stones, and the entrance is due from a ramp, which makes sense. Of course, the pictures on the other side are modern day pictures from Cem Evleri in the east. I don't want to compare the Cem Evleri with the Göbeklitepe sanctuary, but they also have an entrance from the ramps. They are hidden, they are subterranean floors, and they are really monumental. So probably same kind of concept is a kind of a mystic, giving a mystic atmosphere to the thing. Of course, then when all these buildings have sunken floors, we know that they are not freestanding buildings. They are sunken floor buildings, entered by a ramp going down. Then the question of monumentality appears. So they are not monumental as they are appearing from the outside, like the pictures in the National Geographic. They are monumental only when you go inside. They are monumental constructions. Some of these standing stones are 6 meters high, and there are more than 100 of them. And to make a building out of 30 meters dug into the ground with all these standing stones and with the terrazzo flooring is a really enormous social organization and work organization. But they are monumental, you feel the monumentality only when you go in. From the outside, you would only seeing the part of the roof and probably the voices of the ceremonies coming from outside, because the benches in them can be seated on a very small amount of people. And they all have impermeable flooring. Either they have the benches, some of them are sand, and the benches, it's clearly that not everybody was allowed to go in. In most of the buildings, you can only seat 8 to 12 people. In some of the ones like these in northern Syria, they have decorations, they have reliefs on the benches. So a kind of a clergy or elite group could attend the ceremonies in these subterranean floor buildings, and the rest of the community probably was waiting outside and listening to strange noises coming from the ground. It is somewhat like the Hittite temples. Not only the priest was allowed to enter the temple, or in most of the Greek temples also, not everybody was allowed to go in. So I think it's basically the same concept is still with the pre-pottery Neolithic, that only a selected group of people could go in and make the ceremony and say the result of it to the audience who normal community outside. The impermeable flooring is mostly what you call the terrazzo. Terrazzo is a very complicated technique. It is a burning of lime. And to make a terrazzo of 10 meters by 10 meters, which is about 36 centimeters thick, like the one in China, you have to burn a forest to make this cement lime. And the quality of terrazzo is much better than modern Turkish concrete. Of course, there are better ones, worse ones. There are some decorated ones, but the feeling, the fact that there is terrazzo on the flooring, or a sand, or a polished marble flooring, like the slab stones, means that whatever they are doing in the temples involves some kind of a liquid. What liquid is, there are different possibilities. There is some residue of beer. It is possible that because we know that the beer was before cultivated, before cereals. They were able to make beer out of barley, or opium, or blood, or whatever. But certainly some kind of a liquid was involved, and there are some drainage channels, and there are some also vessels, containers recovered in these cult buildings. The other surprising thing which we had difficulty in believing in it, firstly, is that all of these buildings had been intentionally buried, filled in and buried. Well, I call it the humanization of buildings. They are buried like human buildings, leaving some burial gifts, building gifts into it, some of them, which have nothing to do with the function of the building, but they are intentionally filled in. That is why they are so well protected. Otherwise, these standing stones would have never stood. And this, we know that this burying of buildings continued in the later periods also, for example, in Çatalhöyük and Canasan and other parts. So the cult buildings, special buildings, are always buried. Probably it is related to that nobody should be, when its function is finished, nobody should be touching the sacred. Nobody should be protected from being touched. And in many cases, before filling it, they break in and bury some of the cultic objects also into it. To fill in a building like that, it takes a much more time, much more labor than constructing it, because it's 6 meters high. And sometimes when they are filling in especially in the bigger buildings, they make a smaller version into it. They nest a smaller version into it. So the corridor is filled in. When a smaller version is made into it, then the whole thing is buried. So it's a long process. Some of these buildings, they must have survived quite long, and we know that, but they're all buried in. Göbeklitepe has more cult buildings than other sites. In China, where it's 4, in Nevalachor there's 2. Göbeklitepe, now it's clear that there's at least 28. Why is another problem, and we don't really know how many of them were in use at one point, but we know from other sites that the temples, the cult buildings, are not in domestic areas. They are away from in China they were in the easternmost end, in Nevalachor they were outside of the habitation area. So the cult buildings of Göbeklitepe are in the depressions between the settlement mounds. So it's an area reserved for this cultic areas, but we now know very well that one had been excavated last year. There are several domestic buildings, so it's not just a cult center, but it's also, like the other Neolithic sites, it's also a living area. And as I mentioned before, around Göbeklitepe there are now 12 sites, other sites, in the same, within 50 kilometers, having the same kind of building and same kind of T-shaped pillars, which are all around. So it is one of the cultic places. What is in these sculptures is these T-shaped pillars, and these are anthropomorphic shapes. We know that the upper part of the T represents the head, and the sideways there is the hands. So they are, in a way, humanization of the deities. And on the bodies there are some reliefs, which I'll be coming to later. And the central ones are usually different. They are more symbolic, they are higher, they support the roof actually. And some of them are like totem poles. The one in the right is from Nevalachori, and top there is a bird, and the bird is sitting on the head, and below it there's another bird, there's another human being. The one from Göbeklitepe in the center is a human being, birds and bear and everything. So it's a much more, they are telling a story which we don't really know what, but they are telling us very complex story. And these are the ones, the one in the right is a human, full-sized human sculpture from one of the destroyed sites in Urfa. And the reliefs, of course, when we, in the old time, when we speak about prehistoric art, we always thought it was hunting ceremonies with fertility or with kind of subsistence. But what we see in Göbeklitepe and other sites, every moving creature, it's like a shamanistic impact. Every moving creature, every creature that is in their habitat is depicted. It's nothing to do with subsistence, nothing to do with eatable or not. And they are in the natural position, they are insects, they are water birds, they are quadrupeds, there are reptiles, everything which is in their environment is depicted. So it's a kind of a beliefs there, symbolism is got with the nature. I don't like the word shamanism, but there's no, I don't know any other word. And some of our colleagues consider that these are in a threatening position, but I think, as in the other animals I have been showing before, they are as in their natural position. If they would make a very friendly line, it would look more like a Walt Disney, I think. And the other thing is that all of these quadrupeds are male. Clearly, they are male depictions. So there's a multiplicity of snakes, water birds, and some of them are really telling stories, very complex. It must be whoever looked into these pictures, especially one in the right, has about more than 40 different animals. So it's La Fontaine's stories. It must be telling a story which everybody knew probably. And the one in the left is more controversial, with this strange bird playing with something else which looks like a human head. So, but we still don't know what the stories they are telling, but some of them are quite complex. As I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, we were considering Neolithic period with fertility with the mother goddess. But what is really surprising, in the temples there's only male. It's a male-dominated belief system, and there's a phallic symbolism. In all over Göbeklitepe, Nevalachor, and all of seasides, there's only one female figure which came from temples, and it's a lady giving birth, and it's horizontal. All other figures are either don't have a sex. If there's sex, they're always male. And there are hundreds of phallic figurines. It's like a sex shop sometimes. So it's a kind of a real male-dominated belief system. However, when you go to domestic areas, the figure that you find is much more simple made, but they are female figures, and they are usually pregnant. And all the clay figures coming from domestic areas are animals which are domesticated or hunted. So there's a kind of a dualism between the ruling clergy, elite, or whatever, and normal people who are living in domestic areas. They have the mother goddess coming from the Upper Paleolithic there, because there's the Venuses and everything. And this is again with the animals they are going to eat or hunt or feed, but the ones in the temples have nothing to do with this male, and this male character probably is still there in that region. There's also kind of another belief system, is the ancestral cult. China skull building is the biggest one of these. We had more than 460 individuals, and especially skulls. But there are others. There's now more than 1,000 human burials we know. But what is also interesting is that it gives a picture of a clearly non-egalitarian society. What we define as elite is very difficult to define an elite in the prehistory. It's best readable when you look at the burials. There are some burials, whatever it implies, it's difficult, but we can see the differentiation. There are some with rich burial gifts, like these ones from Kurtik. The type of gifts vary, but there are others which are buried with almost nothing. When we had the 600 burials from China, the special buildings stored, and when the building was rebuilt and rebuilt, all the bones had been transported. But at the same time, in the domestic areas, there were other burials. So not everybody was put there. There are different type of burial customs we can see. There are extended burials, collection of heads, with or without heads, with or without burial gifts. So there's a kind of a social differentiation is very clear. Whatever that implies is another story, but at least we can see that it was not an egalitarian, not everybody was treated in the same way. And the picture on the upper left is most touchy one I ever excavated, I think. It's a woman giving birth, dying when giving birth to a twin. One of the twins she is holding in her hand, and the other one is still in the abdomen. And there are traces of decoration on some of the bones, so it's a secondary burials. Some of the bones have been, we knew it from southern Levant before that they were making basques and they were covering with gypsum. But now also in excavation finds in the southeast Anatolia, there are with traces of paint. So clearly, at certain ceremonies, the bones were taken out, cleaned, and put in the ceremonies, and then reburied. So it's a very complex society we are speaking of. And talented art craft specialization. If we were to give this lecture 20 years ago, craft specialization was considered to be special only for the Bronze Age. However, when we look at these things, we are finding in these sites of pre-pottery Neolithic, it's clearly not only craft specialization, but also selection, and not everybody says, can do it, allowed to do it. Especially with the stone vessels, which now is more than 1,900 of them, because we are still in the pre-pottery stage. All of these are chloritite stone vessels from Göbeklitepe. I think when you look at the designs of it and quality of it, and stylistically, I think somebody will be really selecting talented artists, saying that you do it and you should not do it. So it's a kind of a very complex social structure which we are trying to see. And also these ornamental things, especially coming from burials. Most of the societies beads and ornaments, but those coming from pre-pottery Neolithic burials, the rich burials, most of the raw materials are from the region. They are coming from somewhere, and some of them are really difficult to make, like this one bottom, stone inlaid in stone. Or my favorite is again this bead, spacer bead on the upper left. It's a bead of 2 centimeters. It starts with 4 holes. Holes meet in the center and come out as 2 holes. I don't think you can do it now. And the only tools they processed was a flint, because we are still in the pre-pottery Neolithic, and some of the stones, beads are quite hard stones. So some people had time, some people had really specialized, and I think it's a different kind of social organization we are looking at. It's the prestige of the sites. There's no, the technology and the know-how must have been that the added value of these cultures, and not what they are eating, not what they are producing. And so these are these stone plaques from Göbeklitepe, and now they are getting more and more of them. You can make any story out of it, but certainly they were symbolizing something which is very interesting, fetus or whatnot. And also these bone plaques are very difficult to work with, and so I think they are stylistically also very imposing. So it's we are speaking about the time period of experimentation. It's not like any of the conventional societies, which is stable, which is conservative. They are really experimenting. They are trying to understand. They experiment with clay, they experiment with lime, they experiment with anything in the nature. They have been experimenting, and it also like native copper and malachite. Of course, we are much earlier. Hadibe is here, but we are much earlier than first use of metallurgy, but they collected native copper from surface. They tried it. They tried many things. They understood that when it's heated, it's easily made. So they made small things by heat treatment. So it's a kind of a pure technology, but still they don't have the pottery. And long-range connections. Obsidian is the easiest to detect. But the funniest part of the story is obsidian is not a must. Flint is everywhere else, and you can do everything with flint, which you can do with obsidian. It cuts better, but still flint you can do with. And we are still in this cultural stage that there is no transportation, there is no wheel, you have to walk. And the obsidian sources are very limited in areas. And the distribution of obsidian sometimes goes over 1,000 kilometers. Only in China, which is the nearest obsidian source, is 140 kilometers beyond the Taurus Mountains. In the excavated area, we had more than 3 tons of obsidian. So it must be very interactive, very active interaction. And the other thing, which is, I think, very important, is that there is no monopoly. So raw material was coming throughout the pre-pottery Neolithic, from every source to every region. So nobody was monopolizing. So it's a kind of a different social system that we don't have today at present. Nobody is monopolizing. They're capacities, their know-how is their prestige probably. But when we came to the later period, the pottery Neolithic, then we can see that some people are monopolizing the sources, so it becomes a completely different social organization. So what we call the Göbeklitepe culture, which is, I try to picture. And the reason I spoke of is the culture, because as you probably have seen, from Göbeklitepe, only temples are excavated, but the other parts of the settlement, the human life, has yet to be excavated from Göbeklitepe. This fantastic culture, which was in that region for 3,000 years, developed. They experimented with resources in their region. So when it comes to 7,500, already this wheat, barley, legumes, lentils were cultivated. They had this process of domestication, the change of mutations. Wild sheep became wild sheep, goat, boar, and cattle had also been domesticated. So they really became farmers at the end of the stage. But once they became farmers, then this culture collapsed. Then we can see the collapse of the pre-pottery Neolithic culture, and then there's a very rapid dispersal of the farmers. But what is interesting is, it is the moment what we can see this migration of farmers and the system, the elite, the clergy stays on. In all of the areas where this dispersal of Neolithic farmers took place, there are no more temples. There are cult buildings, there are shrines, there are cultic objects, but no temples. The temples stay in that region, and probably they became the foundations of the later Mesopotamian civilization. But this dispersal of Neolithic culture, farmers, lasted for almost 1,000 years. There are different reasons. There are social turbulences, there are environmental crisis. We can make different theories why this dispersal began, but different Neolithic packages had been going with them. But it brought stable village life going with it. So it's a new way of living. But and they had the pottery. Pottery, of course, means a new way of cooking, a new way of food producing, food preparation. So a complete way of living changed. But what is also very important, that the male god, male deity remained in the place, so only the female went. So it's the mother goddess fertility. So it was a moving farmer. That's why it's clearly the moving ones are the farmers, normal domestic people who lived in the domestic areas, but the clergy and the religious system remained. And this was a dispersal of the Neolithic farmers with time, in time, through it took thousands of years, but it became a global system. So it came to Trakya, where I'm working, somewhere around 6,500s. From there on, it became transferred and went to spread all over Europe. So by in 1,000 years, it reached Europe. And in the other direction, it went into Africa, it went into the Mediterranean, it went into Central Asia, where it met the Chinese model, which is a completely different model. So there are different types of neolizations. But anyhow, the beginning of this global system, which went later to the empires and industrial revolution, began actually with Göbeklitepe, but later the communities, the rural communities became much more conservative, less dynamic, but kept on the subsistence pattern. I think I might have over my time, but this is the end of my story. And if there are any questions, I'd be glad to answer if you still have the patience to ask questions. Thank you.
When you were saying, the common belief was that there was no social differentiation in these societies. Now we know that there are different people, elites, etc. I assume in the past there is evidence that some societies don't have much differentiation.
No.
So what happened that some of them have this and then they lost it, or what? Is there a theory?
No, well, there are theories, of course, but I cannot tell what really happened. But what is clear is that what seems evident. Göbeklitepe culture is the one where you can see the cultic practices belief system is much more dominant. It rules the whole society. It must be a very stressful society, constructing and burning, and making all these fancy objects, fancy things for a certain elite. I think that elite probably had their beginning of the system is in Upper Paleolithic, because to make these paintings in the caves, in some of the caves, they are about 2 kilometers inside the cave. So there must be a kind of elite group clergy using this abstraction or this ideology, saying that I am sent by somebody in the upstairs to do this, and he told me that you should help it. Probably it worked in Göbeklitepe, but the moment people had the herds, the sheep, they said goodbye.
You think it's related to domestication of?
It is no. It's also there's a climatical shift. There's other things, but clearly they are going with their sheep and their animals, because before they were real hunters. Still, they had some. They were experimenting, but they were basically subsistence was hunting and gathering. So there were different modalities. But when you come to 7,500, every site, all of a sudden, has lots of domestic animals, sheep. And once you have that much domestic animal, you feed it. And you take it to grazing. And when you say grazing, probably they said goodbye. That's my theory, but there are other archaeologists who might not agree with me, but I think, at least I believe in it. Because it must be a very difficult society to live with. Very rigid.
There's a question about.
I have a general question about archaeology. How do you think archaeology will evolve in the future?
Archaeology, like in any science, you can ask it for any science. Archaeology is one of the sciences looking at the past. If you can answer how geology is going to develop in the future, or paleolinguistics going to develop in the future, the type of questions we will be asking is constantly changing. The questions we ask to the past reflects to our present day thinking. The good thing with archaeology, you can make any picture of the past, but you cannot change the past. That's the good part of it. So you can make any scenario. You can make, like in the 1930s, you can call one race as the most heroic race, and the other one is the most horrible, barbaric one. But still you don't change the past. Somebody can correct it. So the questions we are asking change with time. Later, in the last 5 or 6 years, there's more question about social adaptations, social change, social dynamics, and in interaction among different groups. 10 years ago, it was more in subsistence or environment. There were more climatical things. So it depends, because there are so many different pictures you can make out of the past. So I don't know what the philosophy of 10 years later will be, but the archaeology will be trying to answer that. So I cannot predict. If I wish I would know it.
Do we know the population of the society?
Oh. No, we know that they are not too many, they are not too few. You need and they are, of course, we are speaking about, when you speak about Göbeklitepe culture, we are speaking about 3,000 years. In 3,000 years, the amount of information we have is not that detailed to give it 50 years slices. So we look at 3,000 pressed or 1,500 years pressed into looking into one horizon. So we never can be, our dating methods are not so precise to say that house is 10 years earlier than the other one. So we see it in a dimension of 200 years. So how many of them were real? When these are, when you look at Istanbul for 50 years ago, it was not this Istanbul, and settlements change. But to make that construction, you need a crowd, you need some, and all this interaction. So probably the settlements were somewhere in the margin of 300 people, but it's just a guess. But there were quite a number of settlements in that area, but oh yes, yes, of course, because that's what anthropologists are doing. It's a gentle Mediterranean type. They are quite like us. They are no different because they are Homo sapiens after all. But there's a diversity of, like in this group when you look, there's a diversity. There is this diversity there also. They are a little bit thin-boned. Mortality is low. I think the oldest person we had from China is 52 years old, something like that. But that's normal. They were not too healthy. They had lots of problems. But and with these new methods, and especially with DNA extraction and with this bone morphology and bone chemistry, we know that whether they grown up in a stressful environment or their nutrition. So quite a good number of information is now available.
Yeah, it looks like that there were more than one of these cult places next to each other. Why did they build them? I mean, it would make more sense to have just one.
Of course, that's just a guess. In Göbeklitepe, there are 3 hills where the main occupation is. The depressions, all of these buildings are in these depressions. So probably that was due to the space availability. But it might be another reason also. And we don't really know how many of them were standing at the same time together. There's only, the problem is that because they had been filled in. And there's not much organic material because everything you find in it is earlier than the building. But last year in one of the plasters, they found some organic residue. And they dated it, they had 2 residues, and it became clear that one of the buildings was exposed for about at least 300 or 400 years. But that is only for one of the plaster of one of the buildings.
Let's take one question here.
Actually, it's not too easy to find resources about experimental archaeology in Turkey.
Sorry?
It's not easy to find resources about experimental archaeology in Turkey.
Why?
Well, as an undergraduate student, what would you expect who is interested in experimental archaeology?
Okay. Now, you can consider fossil because of age and what I've been told, I'm a fossil. But there are new generations coming up, and especially the 2 generations after me. It's all kind of open to modern technologies, modern things. And most of them are much more observing what's happening in the world. They are doing experimental archaeology. They are doing many things which my generation didn't do. We even didn't hear about it. So you can't expect everything to happen all of a sudden. But really, truly, of course, there are bad ones also. There is a young generation, 2 generations after me, which is much better than anybody in my generation.
Okay, maybe let's thank our speaker.
Çok sıkmadım inşallah.
Yok, çok teşekkür ederim. Yani çok güzeldi zaten.
Sıkmadım.
Çok yani akıcı, çok güzel. Çok
Sıkmadım inşallah.
Güzel bir konuşma.